Master Gardener Association has partnered with the Tarrant Regional Water District to encourage water conservation. TRWD maintains 4 area lakes and pipelines needed to provide surface water to local water treatment plants so they can clean that water to meet drinking standards for our communities. They also work with many cities in Tarrant County, such as Fort Worth, Arlington, Mansfield, and many others, to provide water conservation programs to the community. Conservation is an important water supply strategy to help meet the needs of our growing population. There are currently 2.3 million people living in Tarrant County, and this is expected to double over the next 50 years. At SaveTarrantWater.com, you can sign up for free weekly watering advice custom to your location. If you're a resident of Tarrant County, you can sign up for a free sprinkler's checkup where a licensed irrigator comes to your home, provides a comprehensive evaluation of your system with recommendations to reduce water waste. There's also an event calendar where you can find information about future classes and workshops. So be sure and check out SaveTarrantWater.com to sign up for their free services.
All right, we're going to talk about landscaping for drought using cacti, succulents, and companion plants. So it's a little bit about these specialized plants that deal with drought, as well as plants that you might put with those to make your landscape more attractive. Next slide, please. The objective of this talk is to reduce the water usage by careful choice of plant material, reduce our landscape upkeep and expense, having an attractive landscape under drought conditions. Next slide. Okay, the term succulent refers to plants that store moisture in their stems, their leaves, or their roots. And so that covers a large number of plants and different families as well in different parts of the world. So we'll talk a little bit about the ones that we might see in this country and might want to use in our landscapes. As well, the succulents can go dormant under stressful environmental conditions. And dormancy means that the plant's metabolism goes down. They may look like they're dried out, and then as soon as it rains, they may come back to life. So there's a lot of different methods that succulents use to deal with stressful environmental conditions. Xeriscaping is a popular term now. It was first used in Denver, Colorado in 1981, combining the Greek xeros, which means dry, with landscaping. So, and it's become a very popular term as applied to landscaping with plants that require little extra irrigation. Next slide. The value of low water use, and I don't know if you've looked at your water bills lately, but conservation of water resources is going to be very important in Texas. North Central Texas, most of our water is from lakes, and we don't have really big aquifers to deal with our water needs. So this is going to be very important in years to come. Dealing with higher annual temperatures and more frequent drought. And I used to kind of joke that after last winter that our plants need to deal with 2 degrees to 105, which is a huge span of tolerance for most of our plants. Having an attractive landscape with careful plant choices is possible, and you do not have to have an ugly landscape to deal with drought. Next slide. Homeowners can start with smaller areas of the landscape that may have some challenges like hot, dry, full sun areas. But remember, not all succulents and cacti can deal with Texas full sun. There's some that need part shade in the heat height of the summer. If they're successful, if the homeowner is successful with one area, they may be encouraged to expand the plantings. So you can start small, and then you can and have a plan in mind, and then expand your areas that will be involved with your succulents, cacti, and your native and adapted plants. Next slide. Reasons for changing to low water usage, ease of maintenance. You don't want to have to be trimming and fertilizing and using insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides on a regular basis in your yard and garden. Also, you need to decrease the expense of city water. And like I said before, my water prices, they installed the new smart meters, and I've noticed a big increase in my water bill. So I'm going to, work at trying to get that down as much as possible. Next slide. Considerations in low water plantings. You want to choose plants that support native ecosystems. You don't want to have just cacti and succulents. You want to have other plants as well. You also have to consider your family. Many of the cacti and other succulents like yucca and agave, which we'll talk about later, have sharp points on the tips and sharp points maybe along the leaves or the stems that can harm children or pets. So you want to choose plants that are best for your family and your environment. You can kind of avoid injuries to children or pets by using raised beds and putting some kind of border around the bed that lifts it above where the children would usually play and the animals would usually be. So it's not completely out, but you have to be careful about these kinds of issues. Choose companion plants that encourage beneficial insects, birds, and other critters, and consider, like, butterflies and bees and all these creatures. I did have a picture of cactus in bloom with a bee on it. I still do, but I didn't put it in here. But these cacti do bloom, and they have beautiful blooms, and the bees love them. Consider the design of the areas to be utilized. You may need a landscaper designer, and there's no reason why, other than cost, that you might consider that. Also consider the expense of changing a large area to xeriscape, and you may want to, again, start with a smaller area. And if you have good success at doing that, then you can expand. And the more you learn about the plants, the succulents and the cacti and the companion plants, the wiser you'll be in making a landscape design. Okay. Next slide. We're going to talk about families of succulents and cacti, mainly for everybody's information. They're fascinating, and they're very diverse. And cacti and agaves actually, or yuccas, are only North American and South American. They're not found in the old world or in Africa or in Asia. So you can find them now. That's because they've been transported by people who love plants and have come to this country and South America and taken the plants back to Europe and to Asia and to the Middle East as well. Agaveaceae includes agaves, and I put agaves and yuccas. Yuccas are in the Asparagaceae, easy for me to say, group, but they're the most commonly seen plants that you will see in Fort Worth and the surrounding areas. Many people love the architectural look of agaves, and the yuccas are so incredibly hardy that they managed to survive the terrible freeze we had and are doing quite well. So they're very valuable in our landscapes. These are large shrub-like plants that are leaf succulents, so they store extra moisture in their leaves. Agaves are also known as century plants, unquote, as they bloom only once and then die. However, it really doesn't take that long for them to bloom and die. It usually could be 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. It's never a century. They do bloom only once and then they die. But before they die, they make other new plants that come out from the bottom of the mother plant that are called pups. And you can harvest the pups as the mother's dying or as it's blooming, and you can start new plants with all the pups that they will put out. So you can continue the same plant. It's just that it'll take a while for it to grow as big as the mother plant. These plants are native to southern and western US and tropical South America, as I mentioned. And again, though, you'll see them all over the world. Each fleshy leaf ends in a barb, and the stem is mostly underground. Yucca have long, stiff leaves with spiny edges and a barb at the tip. Yucca bloom every year and continue to live as perennials as long as they don't, they're not injured or destroyed in some way. So they continue on as perennials, but the agaves can have a limited lifespan. 16 yuccas are native to Texas, 40 to 50 species, all native to the Americas. Next slide. This is an example of a agave americanum. It's so sculptural. It was so beautiful. I had it in a pot until it did get nailed last winter, even with 4 covers of frost cloth, unfortunately. But it was just beautiful. So I've already bought another one and hope for better times. But this is an example of a really pretty sculptural agave. And it does have a barb on the tip, but it's not a real long one. It's a hybridized agave. But I love the green in the center and then the yellow edges. And then there's some that are opposite of that with a light color in the center and darker edges. So there's a lot of hybridization going on right now of agaves, but they're very pretty. And now I'm seeing more and more agaves and yuccas and other cacti and succulents in the nurseries, when I'd say 25 years ago, you just didn't see very many of these around. But even the major nurseries now are beginning to have these plants. It does get frost damage. It'll do fairly well until it gets, below 30. And then it needs to be covered in the wintertime or brought into a greenhouse. Next slide, please. This is in our garden. It's got a few dead leaves intertwined, but boy, is it hard to get those out because it's very spiny. This is agave lechugila. And this thing, completely out in the open, no cover, no anything. And it survived those 2 degrees temperature without a single, you couldn't tell that anything, there was no injury to this plant whatsoever. I am very impressed by the agave lechugila. And the interesting thing is, this is one of the plants, but there's several parent plants around the other edges, and it reproduces by rhizomes that go underground, and then a new plant will pop up in almost any place around the parent plant. So it's multiplied itself. There must be like 12, at least 10 or 12 plants now from the mother plant in the same area. So if you want something extremely hardy, this is a good choice, agave lechugila. Next slide. This is not a true yucca. This is called false yucca, but it's called a yucca because it resembles other yuccas. But it's a Hesperaloe parviflora, and it's in bloom. This picture was taken in June, and this is a home that's close to Ridgeley Country Club. It's a large lot, but they did a really good job of reducing their water usage. They have, in one side, you can see there's Cinezo or Texas sage. There are cedar elms scattered about, and they do tolerate quite a bit of drought. And then the agaves, and then there's cacti, and there's other succulents as well. But they did a beautiful job, and this is a lovely plant. You can see the seed heads on it as well. You can take those seed heads and dry them and and it has little tiny black, well, not tiny, actually, they're rather pretty onyx looking black seeds that you can start these from seed, but it does take a long time for them to germinate. But they are easily available in almost all the nurseries now. But it's a very pretty plant and also very hardy. Next slide. The aloes is another family. It's Asphodela acacia family, has 550 species native to Africa and tropical areas. Well, that kind of tells you right there that they're probably going to have to be brought in for the winter, or are taken care of in some way when it gets really cold. Most widely known plant is aloe vera, but there's many more. It's cultivated for medicinal purposes and also, to put on your skin. Apparently, some people say it helps burns and that sort of thing. I'm not really that knowledgeable about it, but you see it in a lot of different products in the drugstores and grocery stores. These plants have large fleshy leaves coming out of a rosette. They are not frost tolerant, as I mentioned, and they do need winter protection. Sometimes, if the winter's mild, you could probably cover them with several layers of frost cloth if it's going to be below freezing, and you might get away with it, but I've not found that to be true. I put them in the greenhouse in the winter, or you could put them in a garage with some, like a heater or something. Next slide. This is an example. This is my back porch, and this is an example of just an aloe vera. I think they're pretty. They're also sculptural looking, and they are hardy. They're not hardy to cold, but they're really hardy to drought and neglect. And they just reproduce like crazy. As you can see on some of the areas, there's a lot of little new ones that are coming up around the edges. Over to the left, you can't see, but there's a huge one that's literally almost falling out of its pot. It's got so many pups underneath it. So I'm going to have to divide that and put it in separate pots and put it back in the greenhouse. But I think they're pretty. And but again, it needs winter safety. Next slide, please. The Crassula aca family includes succulents such as sedum or stonecrop, and I think we all have seen sedum. Sedum is, there's an endless variety of sedums in many, many different colors, sort of bluish and gray and yellow. And these things make wonderful ground covers, and they look really good in rock formations, rock beds, where you can tuck them in between the stone, or even in a wall. If you've got a rough wall, you can tuck them in, and they're beautiful. And other things that we're familiar with, jade plant, and you see those in the nurseries, calancho, with the bloom spikes with red and yellow, and sempervivum. Now, sempervivum is the typical hen and chicks. Semper means forever or always, and vivum means live, so that means they're always alive. And echeveria is a branch off or similar to sempervivum. Aeonium is a really interesting one. I don't have a photograph of it because I couldn't find one in the nursery, but it's very unusual. It can be almost purpley black, and it has succulent thick leaves on a stem, and it can hang off of it can come out of a pot, a hanging basket. It's just really pretty. Dudleya is a very interesting plant. It looks like a lotus, and you find these in California that grow wild on the cliffs above the beaches in California. And a little story I told last time I talked about this was that they're very desirable in Asia, because people live, in apartments in smaller areas, and they love them because it looks like a lotus, which is something that's prized, and it has lovely blooms. However, it's a lot of people will fly in from Asia, and they will go out, they'll get boxes, and they'll go out to the cliffs in California, and they'll steal them and then take them back to Asia, and they get big money for them in Asia. So California people are looking out for these plants so that they don't get stolen. The Graptopetalum is very similar again to echeveria. All of these look somewhat similar, and I think that they get them into the families because they do DNA studies on them now, the botanists do, so they can divide them more accurately into another family. These are all low-growing succulents with simple, fleshy leaves. The only thing that would be tall would be the sedums that are in the Hylotelophynium genus, such as autumn joy sedums, and you probably are much aware of those. They've got new cultivars now that are different colors than the usual, and the stalks are stronger, so they don't tend to flop over. So if you see them in the nursery, they make good plants in the garden, and they don't really like just full hot sun. Part of the day sun, and then the rest of the day should be semi-shade or dappled shade. Next slide, please. This is an example of the hen and chicks. And as you can see, they're always alive because you get maybe one plant in here, two plants in here, three plants. Maybe these are the parent plants here, these four. And then you have all the little babies all around it. And you can take those babies off and stick them down in some coarse sand or a potting mix that's mixed with, a cactus mix or something that's real well draining, and they'll sprout roots, and then you'll have more plants. It is sempervivum. It's always alive. Next slide, please. This is the echeveria, and as you can see, it's a little bit different structure. This is just an example of one. There's all different ones. Some of them have pink on the ruffles on the edges. There's others in different colors. They tend to have thick succulent leaves, but they tend to be not as clustered as tightly as the sempervivum. So you can see this is just an example of one. I always have to, when I go to the nursery and I'm looking for succulents, I really have to read the labels sometimes to tell what I'm getting. But you can tell this is considerably different. Next slide, please. Cactiaceae, oh goodness gracious, it's in a class all by itself. These are stem succulents with stems that are flattened, swollen, or elongated. And if you think about all the different cacti you've ever seen in pictures, the flattened would be the ones that you see, the prickly pears that you see. And the elongated ones would be the ones like saguaros, in Arizona. And then the swollen ones would be like the barrel cactus. But believe me, one of the books I have at the end that I recommend, it has an enormous number of different shapes of cacti, and they're all just fascinating in different colors as well. All cacti have areoles, and these are nodules that produce spines, glochids. Now, glochid is a type of spine, but it's very small, very thin. But believe me, if you get too close to the cactus, a prickly pear, you will get glochids in your skin, even if you don't get the spines. So you have to be very careful how close you get. If you brush against one, you'll probably get the little tiny spines that stick in your clothes, and you have to pluck them out of your skin with tape or something. And also it produces, the areoles produce the flowers that bloom for the cacti. Moisture is retained in the stems, and areoles are arranged in regular spaces along the pads or ribs of columns. Opuntia is the genus for prickly pear. And again, these plants have been used and still are used for food, as the young pads of the new growth in the spring can be scraped clean of spines and cooked. Some people cut them into strips and put cornmeal on them and fry them. And I've not tried that, but they say it's good. The fleshy fruits called tunas, I have no idea where that name comes from. It can be made into jelly or syrup, and I'll have a picture in just a second. The eaten pads are called nopales, and they're used very much in Mexico and other places. And of course, cacti are found all through North America and South America and Central America. And you find them now around the Mediterranean, large groups. I've been in the Mediterranean Sea and noted on the cliff sides that there's opuntia from this country or from South America are growing there on the Mediterranean edges. The spineless prickly pear is called Opuntia alesiana, and in our garden we have a true prickly pear, and then we have one that's a spineless prickly pear. Next slide, please. This is an example in the nursery of a hybridized prickly pear, and it's beautiful. And there's another one that I probably should have taken a picture of it had the nodules or the areoles are orange. And so you have the green with the orange. It's really, and then this is the green with the yellow. Yeah, I think they're really pretty. They can be prickly. They're not generally as prickly as their parent prickly pear, but they still can put little glochids in your skin. But I just think that one's really pretty. The orange one was also very pretty where the areoles were orange. Next slide, please. This is a barrel cactus. This is a typical barrel cactus. And as you can see, the nodules or the areoles are arranged on the top of the ribs. And these plants, this type of barrel cactus is very interesting because if they have a sudden onset of rain, the ribs will expand and fill out. And then they slowly utilize the water. And as they utilize the water down where it's almost, it's very low, then the ribs become deeper on the plant so they can expand. The other thing they'll do, if you plant several in a row and the sun is mostly from the west, they'll all lean toward that area. And there's some pictures in some of the books I have of a whole bunch of barrel cactus leaning toward the sun. So that's, it's kind of interesting to see. But this is where usually in this type of cactus, the flower is at the top. And again, different cacti have different methods of survival. If I was a herbivore, I definitely would not take a bite of this. It would be disaster. So if you plant them yourself, you can wrap something. Next slide, please. This is a really nice picture I took of the Opuntia easier for me, Alesiana in bloom, and you can still see that this is the tuna, this is the fruit, this is the bloom, and you can see the anthers and the filaments, and then in the center is the female part of the flower, and then this is one that's been pollinated, so it's changing now into a fruit, and these fruits when they're ripe can be really dark purple. And when you see them dark purple like that, they're ready to eat. And of course, you still, when you harvest them, have to realize that even the spineless prickly pear has these little spines on the fruit. even though so you still have to be careful with them. And they remove the outer part of this, and the inside has like it's sweet inside, and there's seeds, but they can strain the seeds out, and they can make jelly, or they can make syrup out of the fruit of the prickly pear. Next slide, please. Okay, the Isoaceae family includes mostly South African plants, such as lithops. I don't know if you've ever heard of lithops, but these are plants that grow in the desert, mainly in Africa, in the different African deserts, and they look just like stone. They usually have a divide in the center. There's usually two portions to them, and the center portion of the plant has a division, and a bloom comes out of that center division. But you don't even know that they look so much like stone that you don't even know that they're real, sometimes that they're a plant. They're very interesting. I've seen, if you go online and Google lithops, there's lots of pictures of those, but I didn't have any source for them here. Living stones, and then Delosperma, which we all really know pretty well, known as ice plant. And I have a picture of the ice plant one. That's not exactly the prettiest one, but it has beautiful, very colorful blooms, and it has little thick succulent leaves on it, and it really takes the heat very well. Also, the Portulaceae family includes moss rose, which I think we're all familiar with, and hybrid purslane. Yeah, usually I'm pulling up purslane as a weed, but the hybridized purslane, which I'll have a picture, make beautiful pots in the summertime. They also take the heat really well. They don't need a lot of water, and but they're annuals. They're not going to survive winter, but they're really gorgeous in pots. Lewisia succulents are named for Meriwether Lewis, the partner of Lewis and Clark, the American explorer who noted them growing on cliffs in the West. And I had some little extra information about that is the Lewisia succulent is also called bitterroot. And that's because the Native Americans used them as culinary and medicinal plants. And the bitterroot gave its name to Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, river, and valley. And it is the state flower of Montana. And these plants were sent back to a botanist. I thought maybe Jefferson may have called them Meriwether Lewisy because of Meriwether Lewis, but it was a botanist. His name was Frederick Pursh, P-U-R-S-H, and he's the one who named it Lewisia after Meriwether Lewis. So a little bit of history there. Never hurts to know something extra. All right, next slide, please. Here's an ice plant, and you can see that was these stones were at the house that had the false yucca that was so nice. It looked like it could use a little water, but it's still, the blooms are just gorgeous. If you give it a little water, it's going to thrive. You don't have to, but it also makes a lovely pot, and you can find this in the nurseries now. In the spring and early summer, almost all nurseries carry ice plant now. And again, a pot of it on a stone wall, or a pot of it, out, and it can take quite a bit of sun. I don't put this one in full sun, partial sun, and it seems to do a little bit better. Next slide, please. All right, this is purslane. This is hybridized purslane in a pot, and you can see it's gorgeous. The blooms are beautiful. It blooms all summer long. And unfortunately, you have to compost it or whatever in the late fall. But just the same, or put it in the greenhouse. I have not tried it in the greenhouse to see if it could winter over. It fills up the pot so rapidly, and it grows so fast that it's just a tangled mess when you try and take it out of the pot. But just the same, it's beautiful, and it's certainly worth putting. You could put these in the ground if you wanted to, but again, they may not make the winter. Next slide, please. I just want to mention euphorbias because they do have spines or thorns, and a lot of people confuse euphorbias with cacti. The euphorbia family is also called the spurge family, and they do have spines, but they are stem succulents. Many with thorns, but not all have thorns. It's a very large family, not as large as orchids, but it's a very large family. A lot of them have issues, which we'll mention. They do not have areoles, and they all have white latex sap when cut. and the sap can be toxic. I have had euphorbias, and you have to be very careful if you trim them back or cut the stems at all. A white latex comes out. You should never rub your eyes when you're working with these plants. You should never get it on your skin if you can help it. So they're not exactly plants you would want to put around young children, or you might taste one, or a dog that might chew one. So you have to be careful with these plants. But we know there's a number of these plants that we know we're very familiar with. Crown of thorns is an example of euphorbia with thorns, and the thorns in euphorbia grow from the stem, but they're not organized. They don't grow along like the areoles in a pattern. They just grow randomly along the stem. Poinsettias are another well-known euphorbia. They grow thorns, but not modified leaves. So in cacti, the thorns really are modified leaves. Their flowers are unusual, as some are only stamens and some are only pistils, and some of them have really unusual structure. Some other euphorbias that you might know would be castor bean. And as you know, castor bean can be very, very lethal. And then cassava, which is a starchy root that's used a lot in the tropics for food. It has to be processed carefully because it's got cyanide glycosates in it. And if you don't process it appropriately, people can die or get really, really sick from cyanide poisoning. So euphorbia family can have some lovely plants. And again, poinsettia is one of our favorite plants. It was named after a gentleman who from America who was an ambassador to Mexico years ago, who kind of, quote, discovered, unquote, the plant. But they're fun plants, and there's nothing wrong with using euphorbias in your landscape as well, as long as they are winter hardy. Next slide, please. Preparing a site for cacti and succulents and low water companions. As you know, you can't just dig a hole and put things in it and expect them to thrive, especially in North Central Texas. Our growing conditions vary quite a bit. In Arlington and some other places, they do have some kind of sandy loam and other types of soil. We mostly have the black clay, which really is not something you want to put a cacti or succulent into. Especially plants that really don't like their feet wet. Most helpful to elevate the bed above ground level or use raised beds to ensure good drainage. And I learned every bed I have now is raised bed. I have found that it's just not worth it, aggravation trying to grow things in clay. Remove existing vegetation if you want to put a bed in with layers of cardboard, or use a herbicide. When we did our bed in some years ago, we all got together, we hunted out all the cardboard we could possibly find, and we put cardboard down to kill all the plants that were the weeds and grass and things that were there. And then we put the beds on raised beds on top of that, and our walkways on top of the cardboard. Suggested mixes for beds include 50% landscaper mix, which would be sand and compost, plus 25% pea gravel and 25% expanded shale. Or another choice would be 50% lava sand soil mix with 60% compost, 30% sand, 10% lava sand, plus 50% pea gravel. And either one of those would work fine. And what you want is you want a company that's local, that that would make the mix for you and could deliver it to you possibly, or you could have somebody like your yard guy put it on and bring it to you so you could shovel it off and make your beds. But we had it delivered. I think we used Silver Creek materials, but I don't get a kickback from Silver Creek. But Whiskey Stone, and there's some other really good companies around. If you Google companies for bed supplies for plants, there's a number of them that come up. But we did use Silver Creek for our beds. Next slide, please. Excuse me, I was getting dry. Design your planting with the largest plants first. So if you have a sculptural agave that's a reasonable size, you want to start that one first and then add in the smaller plants around it. You want to mulch the plants with pea gravel and interesting larger stones or cow skulls. We have one cow skull that's still in fairly good shape, and the other one's pretty disintegrated. But you can also use anything that strikes your imagination. You can use really beautiful stones that you strategically place around the plants that are, different color stones, some, like larger stones, not just the small stones, but larger stones that make it, they catch your eye. You can also line it with wine bottles or just anything you think that looks good on in your yard or in your landscape. Irrigate on a regular basis until the plants are established, and best use drip irrigation to avoid standing water and wet plants that cause rot and fungal disease. These plants really tolerate a lot of things. They tolerate drought much more than they tolerate too much water. And you want to, again, if you make a raised bed, you don't have to have a fancy a stone around the bed or anything that's really expensive. You can just make a dome of your soil for your plants in the lawn, and I'll show you a picture of one in a minute. That's just a little above the ground level, but it still adds to the ability of the plants to not have wet feet. Consider sun exposure. Some succulents do not tolerate full hot sun, and sun in Texas is not sun in New Hampshire. Okay, it's different, and you have to do your research carefully to match plants to your landscape exposure. And as well, reflected heat from walls or your home may be too much exposure for some plants. You have to judge, and sometimes our landscapes are like trial gardens. You lose some and you win some. So you may have to try some things, and if it doesn't succeed, then try something else. And I always feel like each year I like to try something I haven't done before to see how it works. Add in native and adaptive plants to provide for pollinators and keep the bed visually interesting. And we have a lot of native and adaptive plants that do beautifully in drought conditions. Next slide, please. Suggested companion plants are legion. There's so many plants in Texas that are adapted and do well for low water use. Russian sage is one that's really kind of pretty. Rock rose, Spanish lavender, lamb's ears, artemisia, cenizo or Texas sage, lantana, coreopsis, yarrow, santolina, indigo spires, Mexican marigold, which mine's just starting to bloom now, rudbeckia, and most salvias. You can't go wrong with salvias. A Mexican bush sage or salvia, mine's just glorious right now. And then salvia gregae and others, you can't go wrong as long as you pick carefully. But all of these plants look good with succulents. Now I didn't mention grasses. Hello, I didn't mention grasses, but there's the blue fescue looks really good with a lot of things, and also some of your other grasses that you can put in with these as well that tolerate drought. Next slide, please. This is rudbeckia, and you can see my agave back there. This got damaged, but it's still alive, and it's got a nice pup underneath there. So I'm keeping it until I can get that pup, but I don't have the heart to toss it. It's got some burned areas on it, but it did survive. And the other one was mush, but this one did make it. But the rudbeckia is glorious in the summertime, and you can cut it back, and when it kind of gets leggy and finished blooming, and you may get another group of blooms as well in the fall before it frosts. Next slide, please. And this is your Mexican bush salvia or sage. And the bees are all over this, and the butterflies like it too, but the bees are just all over it. One year, I've had it for several years. One year I cut it a little bit early because I thought it was too leggy, and the bees were following me around where I was taking the stalks of the plant. They're like, please, please don't do this. We would like to have some more honey from this. But it's a beautiful plant, and it does get a little leggy in the late summer. Like right now, it's a little bit leggy. But I leave it as long as possible so that the bees can have their share. Next slide, please. And this is just an example now here of Salvia gregae, the red and the purple. They've hybridized a lot of the Salvia gregae, and they can get a little leggy too, but you can also cut those back after they quit blooming, and you'll get another flush of blooms. This plant, though, requires more water. This is called cestrum. It's a tropical plant, and I did not think it would make it in the wintertime. I cut it way back down but it came out like gangbusters. So it looks fine, but it will freeze. But it's like I cut it back and mulch it, and it seemed to do fine. And at nighttime, I've noticed that moths, particularly the hummingbird moth, I don't know if you've ever heard of that before. It's a moth at nighttime that comes, and if you go out there and watch, you'll see them, and they'll be getting nectar from these tubular yellow blooms at night. It's really magic to see that. All right, the next slide, please. This is just a house not far from me, and they just barely got this raised above the level. It's just barely, but that's phlox, which do require a little more water. But they've got agave, and I think that's a yucca, and then there's the false yucca there, and then they have lamb's ears here, and they've got more false yucca there, and they've got cannas and different things like that. There's just an example of a small yard that they're trying to incorporate some dry, drought tolerant plants. Unfortunately, the St. Augustine is going to require more water by far than the agaves and the yuccas will. Next slide, please. This is a house not too far from me in a little fancier neighborhood than mine, and a lot fancier neighborhood than mine, actually. This is a tree form yucca, and we do have one in the garden right now. And these things are very hardy. It had a little bit of damage from the frost, but it just did beautifully in our garden. This is an agave. This is the Senezoe, our Texas sage. This is another agave. I'm not sure if that's rosemary or not. I'm not sure. But if you go down this path, they have a large prickly pear down the path, and they've got other mounds of plants that are adapted. So it goes really well with sort of the Spanish style house, but you don't have to have a Spanish style house to have this kind of design. The only house that doesn't really fit real well would be what I call the terra house, which would be like a formal Southern house with giant columns, all white and everything. But most homes are ranch style, or they can accommodate almost any of these plants. Again, there's some St. Augustine, there's just a strip of it. As far as grasses go, buffalo grass will tolerate drought better than any of the other grasses we use. Zoysia would probably be the next one down, Bermuda, and then the last would be St. Augustine. But if I had it to do over, I would do zoysia. It's expensive to put in your lawn, but it has a really tough, it tolerates foot traffic really well. So you can have children and dogs. Zoysia is very tolerant of foot traffic, and also it's more tolerant of drought than St. Augustine. Next slide, please. This is the house again. I just want to show you they have the spineless prickly pear here, and you can't hardly see the nodes on these, but they're rather pretty. And then they've used a lot of stone, and then there's the false yucca there, and again, I believe that's the cedar elm. And then off in the distance, you've got more plants in the distance. So it's really a nice landscape. Next slide, please. This is a house not too far from me. They used this is a yucca, a color guard. It's a hybridized yucca, but it's very pretty, and you can see it looks really good. And this is just part shade. It's part sun, part shade under here, so it's doing fine. And then there's a large agave over here, and again, it's just dappled sun, but it looks fine. Again, more color guard. We have a color guard in our garden that we did that Dick Pafford donated to us, and I had to spray it. I rarely have to take any action on the plants, but it got yucca bugs. Believe it or not, there's such a thing as yucca bugs. They actually are like a little tiny beetle, and they will suck the juices out of the yucca. So I used a bonide for them, and I think that we're done with them for now, but they have returned after a couple years. Next slide, please. This is an example. This is the garden. At one time, you couldn't get between here and the fence, and because there were just weeds all here. So we put down a weed barrier, got all the weeds out, put down weed barrier, and then put decomposed granite on top of that. And decomposed granite is heavy if you carry it in buckets or anything, but it makes a nice cover. Weeds will eventually come up in it, but not in moss. It's controllable with weeds, but some weeds will come up in it. And we put that in the center as well. And this is the color guard right here, yucca, and you can see it has bloomed. And the plant behind it, I didn't really talk about this plant. It's Soto. It's a Texas native plant as well. It is a type of succulent, mostly stem succulent, but it has a bloom spike that goes up really tall, and it's remarkable. I have another photograph, you can see it. The tree over here that has all of the leaves here is a Mexican Palo Verde tree, and it did not make it through the frost. I waited until late May and June to have it taken out, but the whole thing was just totally brown. Nothing even came out from the bottom. I'm hoping to replace it with a Texas Palo Verde tree, and I have found a source for that, but I'm going to have to get rid of the stump. I've had it cut and put a root, stump remover on it, but it looks about the same to me. So I'm going to have to see what I can do. But it is interesting plant because it's very, very prickly. But the trunk and the branches and everything on it will be green when it's young, because it photosynthesizes from all over the whole plant. So the whole plant has this beautiful green color. This one's a little bit older, so it's got more brown to it, but it has beautiful yellow flowers in the spring. It's very pretty, but I'm hoping to replace it, but with one that's not Mexican. The Mexican Palo Verde is native to the Sonoran Desert. The Texas Palo Verde is more native to our desert here in Texas, in South Texas, way South Texas. Next slide, please. This is just another view of the garden that we made. This is a Spanish dagger. We also lost it this spring. I was sad because a mockingbird always made a nest right in the top of that. I thought she was very clever because nothing's going to bother her up there. Spanish dagger is very aptly named. These things are really heavy like a sword, and the points on them, you only back into it once and you never do that again. This is the spineless prickly pear, and you can see the blooms on it. And then this is a tree-form yucca. It hardly was damaged at all by the frost. And then there's the bloom of a Soto. You can see it's just magnificent. It goes way up. And of course, when it gets old, you just cut it off. And then there's the Palo Verde tree, and there's a palm, but we've replaced the palm that had one of our classmates donated a small saguaro. And it may not make it here because it's native to Arizona and southern New Mexico as well, but it might. And then this is their prickly pear right here. And this, you can see the blooms from the false yucca, but it makes a nice, pretty garden. Most people like it. And we don't have too much shade now because we lost some plants, but I'm hoping to replace this tree, and I'm hoping to get something that will eventually get larger there as well. This is the Senezoa, our Texas sage right there. And you can see the small growths down there of the agave lechuguillas. But I hope this inspires you a little bit because it wasn't difficult to make. We used the limestone stones that we found around the landscape here because it's kind of a caliche hill out there off of Campus Drive. So we didn't have to buy any borders. And then we kind of lifted the beds up and put that mixes that I mentioned before. And then we put the gravel on top of the pea gravel on top there to mulch. And it stays looking pretty good. You have to get some weeds out here and there, but just the same, it's been there for almost 10 years now. And it's looks a little different right now with some missing plants, but we're going to see what we can do. I hope this inspires you. I love succulents and cacti. I think they're fascinating. I'm not exactly best buddies with the prickly pear because I've had to come home to shower and found spines all along my upper arms where I brushed against, the prickly pear, and I'm trying to pluck those out. And, so you have to be careful around it. And again, with young children, you probably would do better with the spineless than you would with the regular prickly pear. Next slide, please. References. Here's some books that are excellent references. Gaves, Yucca, and Their Kin, 7 Genera of the Southwest by John Hawker, Texas Tech University Press, 2016. And it's the pictures are mostly black and white pictures, but he as he went around the areas that he was interested in, he took his Labrador retriever. So there's lots of pictures of the Labrador by whatever he was taking pictures of. So it gives you some perspective. If you know what size Labradors are, you can get a perspective of what the plants look like in size. A Gardener's Guide to Cactus by Scott Calhoun Timber, Press, Portland, Oregon, 2012. You would not believe all the cactus that he has, and pictures are beautiful of the different cactus. And some of you say, oh, I'd like to have that, but you might not be able to find it anywhere, but beautiful photographs. I have the first edition of Deborah Lee Baldwin. She's well-known designing with succulents, Timber Press, Portland, Oregon, 2017. But I have both books, the first and second edition, and the pictures are just glorious, and the advice is very good. A Complete Book of Cacti and Succulents by Tara Hewitt is also an excellent book. And then something that you might consider, because if you want to do a lot of outside planting, Hardy Succulents by Gwen Moore Leeds. There's a picture in there of snow in Colorado on the succulents. And if that isn't hardy, I don't know what is. So it gives you some idea of what plants might do well in really cold weather. And you have to consider also altitude, you have to consider rain, all those kinds of things as well. But just the same, all of those books I thought were good references, and just thumbing through them is kind of fun.